The big news break this evening. Nirav Modi keeps denying that he did anything wrong, but it appears that he may have diverted crores of bank money into a personal trust. The CBI FIR against Modi says that he embezzled close to 6,000 crores from the Punjab National Bank in the form of credit. That credit went to 3 Nirav Modi companies, and now it turns out that a big chunk of the cash from one of those companies may have gone to a Nirav Modi family trust. My colleague Srinivasan Jain with more on that big story. Vasu, tell us more.
All right, this is actually fantastic work by our colleague Manas Pratap Singh. I wish he could have also been here on the show with us, but essentially this is what Manas's investigation has found. That, as you said, Nirav Modi has been claiming that at best he just owes banks money. He's done no wrong. But a large chunk of the cash that the CBI claims he's embezzled from banks has gone to these 3 companies: Diamond R Us, Solar Export and Stellar Diamonds. Now, all these 3 companies are proprietorship firms or partnership firms, which means, Nidhi, that their documents are not in the public record. But Manas, in his research, looking at each and every Nirav Modi company whose documents were in the public record, found a company which actually had details of Diamonds R Us's books. And what he found is that Diamond R Us, which had 3 partnership firms, one of those firms is a Nirav Modi family trust. And in the financial year 2014-15, this family trust has withdrawn 540 crores from Diamond R Us, therefore placing Diamond R Us into a negative balance. So effectively, this company, which has been receiving crores of rupees of bank money, supposedly to try and carry out these overseas transactions for Nirav Modi, is a bankrupt company. It's been bankrupted by a Nirav Modi family trust. And this paper trail exists across both financial years, 14-15 and 15-16. So till the last available findings that we have, this is money which is in the Nirav Modi family trust books. Now, we don't have access to the other companies named in the FIR, which also received LOU cash, and so we don't know if money has even been siphoned off from there. But interestingly enough, Nidhi, when Saurabh Gupta, our colleague in Bombay, went to the offices of Diamond R Us, the guard told him no such company exists. What's the company there? What operates out of there? The Nirav Modi Family Trust. Nidhi.
All right, Vasu, thanks very much for that. And what it really proves is how somebody like Nirav Modi, and there are many Nirav Modis out there who are able to swindle banks in the way that they're able to do it, whereas people who are honest taxpayers are now worried about whether they can trust public sector banks. Thanks very much for that, Vasu. Let's go straight across to our panel tonight to talk about that very question and what the solutions could possibly be. Is privatization of PSU banks the answer? Is better regulatory mechanisms and overhaul of the RBI? What are the possible solutions that are out there? Joining us on the program this evening, we're happy to have Mr. Biswajit Bhattacharya, the former Additional Solicitor General of India, who's also been a former banker. He's back with us on the program this evening. Great to have you, sir. Anil Gupta, the Vice President of ICRA Limited and a member of the Ratings Committee, is with us tonight. Shubhamoy Bhattacharya, Consultant Editor with the Business Standard. Shivam Singh with the India Foundation. And the 2 politicians tonight, Hitesh Jain, who's a member of the BJP and an advocate of the Supreme Court, and Pawan Khera, Congress spokesperson. Mr. Bhattacharya, let me ask you first. We've seen how this entire story has played out. According to you, what would you tell people today who ask you if their money is safe in PSU banks? Would you tell them to trust PSU banks?
There is no option but to trust.
That's not a very good answer.
Because I'll tell you why. Today, India's GDP is 2.5 trillion US dollars. Banking business is of the same magnitude. The PSU bank business is of the order of 2 trillion US dollars. So it can't afford to fail. If PSU banks fail, government fails. And I think that message has to go loud and clear to the powers that be. 2 trillion, almost 2 trillion, it's a mind-boggling figure. And if one bank is allowed to fail, then there can be a chain and cascading reaction. I don't think no government, no country in the world can afford this. This has to be done at whatever cost, come what may. But I don't think the manner in which things are going, the enormity and gravity of the problem has been realized by the powers that be.
Which is my next question, because what you're saying is different from what I'm asking. ideally, yes, governments should realize the enormity of the problem
Yes.
and that you can't afford to let a PSU bank collapse.
No way.
And if they are not realizing the enormity of the problem, then, you know, what do you tell ordinary folks who today are worried about where their money is?
No, you see, before I answer your question, the first question which comes to my mind, what has happened? How do you crack it? The foremost consideration and priority of the government should be to crack it, and it can be cracked within a span of a few days. I'll tell you how. This 1.8 billion US dollars have gone, as per press reports, into the Nostro account of Punjab National Bank, dollar account in New York.
Yeah.
Nostro account means our account with them. So every credit entry, so the moment Punjab National Bank Nostro account has been credited abroad in New York, say in Chase Manhattan Bank, immediately Punjab National Bank International Division and Punjab National Bank Brady House branch would get to know. So an item credited by, say, Chase Manhattan Bank into the account of Punjab National Bank, so they should respond it. And if those funds have come unauthorizedly, immediately the very first transaction, Punjab National Bank should refund. Sorry, these funds I am not able to reconcile. Similarly, every debit entry, so therefore the investigating agencies should first call out the Nostro account statement, tally each and every entry, and every banker, every international banker is supposed to check each and every Nostro debit and credit. Instead of raiding here, raiding there, you can crack the whole scam within a matter of 2, 3, 4 days.
Well,
who are the persons? Who are the
I hope
persons?
they're listening.
Who are the persons who were tracking the Nostro account? The entire scam
Centers
alleged
around that,
scam,
ultimately,
is
doesn't
already
it?
debit credit entries of that dollar account of Punjab National Bank in New York.
Shivam Singh, I think the problem today is, do you think that people are losing faith in public sector banks? I mean, do you think that trust has been eroded now?
So I don't think trust is eroding at all, because people recognize that PSU banks are actually guaranteed by the sovereign, they're guaranteed by the country and the government of the country. They would still trust PSU banks just because the entire government machinery is basically backing the entire system, and no one will lose their money in the entire process. No depositor will be allowed to lose their money at all. So what does need to happen is that we do need to figure out what the quantum of loss in all of these scams is. The status of PSU banks in the last 1.5 decades has been completely destroyed. There have been a lot of scams, there have been NPAs. Now we see this new letter of credit scam. There are probably more misappropriations that have happened through the PSU banking system just because of the lax regulation in the past 1.5 decades. We need to figure out how much the total exposure of the banks is and formulate a policy on how the government is going to handle this entire situation.
Is it actually much worse, the exposure, than we think it is?
It could be, considering the audit mechanism has been so lax that we did not realize that this was going on since 2011. Someone has taken out over 11,000 crores from a government PSU bank, and we did not know about it till 2017, 2018. So in this circumstance, we really need to think what the total exposure is and audit the entire books of all PSU banks in the country.
Mr. Gupta, do you think that this shakes the confidence in India's banking system, particularly PSU banks? Do you think that this has an adverse effect on the banking system as a whole?
See, if we look from the domestic investor perspective, definitely given the faith which people have in the domestic public sector banks, so I think the faith per se for the common man remains. But if we look at the international community, definitely the level of tolerance which the international community will have in dealing with Indian banks. So let's say, for example, something like an exporter has to deal with a foreign bank overseas, and if he is having a relationship with a weak PSU bank, definitely the level of confidence of like facilitating a trade internationally, that gets impacted. So international community will not take it very favorably as compared to maybe domestic investor who knows there is a sovereign support which is going to come for the banks.
And what is the implication of that when the international community, the banking community kind of loses faith or trust in our banking system? What are the consequences of that? Explain that to our viewers.
Yeah, so basically, see, if you look at if today the LOUs are being disputed, so payment against these LOUs are being disputed, that whether these are bona fide or not. If you go back to the 2014 episode of In Some Diamonds also, at that same point in time, the liabilities on account of the LCs were also disputed by the public sector banks, but later on they were asked to pay up the foreign banks. So what happens is, if the counterparties with whom you are dealing internationally, if they don't trust in you because there is a likelihood that you may not honor your LOUs or LCs, then how do the Indian exporter or importer deal with the foreign companies who may have banking relationship with the foreign banks? So yeah, as such, what happens is, today these are only the domestic banks which have been involved in these LOUs. But let us say if there have been foreign banks, what would have been like the confidence in dealing with the public sector banks, Indian public sector banks, that would have been completely shattered.
Shubhama Bhattacharya, when
that impacts the trade for the country as a whole.
And you've explained actually very well, very simply, you know, what the implications are. When you look at the figures of willful defaults, it's actually quite staggering and it's scary. In terms of what the solutions are we just looking at band-aid solutions right now? I mean, there are some who say that you need to privatize PSU banks. You think that's the solution? I mean, how do you see the way it's being addressed?
Nidhi, this is something that the government should have been talking about years ago, but to take it on, I mean, what you are asking is so fundamental. Let's put it this way. First of all, a government bank is an oxymoron. It just can't exist just on the basis of a public exchequer's bank bailout. A bank is a financial entity that rests at the corner of the entire financial system. If a bank collapses, then that reason why there's a tremor is because the bank's collapse is such a huge deal, which is why a bank should not be a government entity just because the government is giving it this operating support. So first of all, government banks should be privatized. That's the first thing.
Okay, so you do support that.
I support that. Second part is, when you say the willful default, that is the biggest problem. You know what? I am not concerned about today Nirav Modi's 11,000 crore. I am more concerned about what comes later, because that figure of willful default you've given, the public today is conflating that willful default with other defaults which are not willful, and essentially saying, why should those defaults be paid out from my taxpayers' money? So essentially what is happening is not just the default now, but the government's ability to pump in money into any bank is now going to be questioned. It was being questioned, it's now going to be questioned even more, and that is the biggest challenge. That if the government needs, today these banks need extra capital. They had been pumped in $2.6 billion, 2.6 billion crores, and we had and their market cap has come down to 2 billion. That means a market erosion at a fundamental loss of fundamental loss of capital. Now, if that is the sort of thing that's happening next time, and it's not even next time, the Basel III is just around the corner, we will need to shore up the capital of these banks. The amount of support, lack of support that Parliament is now going to face, and I think every MP will have to face that question from his constituents, that why should these banks be supported to shore up a tottering financial sector? And that is a very big challenge which we had been pushing under the carpet for long.
Let me ask Hitesh Jain about that, because that was actually my next question. That's an excellent point that you've raised. That Hitesh Jain, what will the government say to taxpayers who are going to throw up their hands and say, why should you use my money to save a bank where some guy like Nirav Modi willfully defaulted? I mean, even just the number of willful defaulters is actually scary. I'm not even talking about those others who have defaulted. Hitesh Jain, do you agree that it's going to become harder and harder for the political establishment to defend this?
Let me answer the question in a perspective, because to answer the question we have to also look at this whole aspect of private banks, as well as we are talking about the public sector bank. Now, in this last 16 to 18 years, the biggest scam that happened in 2008, when we were talking about all the banks in United States and world across, they were all private sector banks. Exactly. There was no public sector and all. What was the common element? The element was greed. Thereafter, what was the another scam we saw? We saw a lot of derivative scams, and the private sector banks also coming out with the exotic products that were in the Supreme Court, international courts on the derivative. There was massive litigation that took place for almost 7 to 8 years. Again, what is the thing? The bankers were becoming greedy for the commission profits or whatever these things. So this whole idea that, you know, private sector will give the privatization will give PSU, it is all subjective. Basically there has to be a proper systems of checks and balances. Yes, I mean, one of the reforms can be that whether there should be 20 or 21 public sector banks, whether we can have with 4 or 5 public sector banks, whether there should be consolidation, and the process the process is happening insofar as the consolidation is happening. Now, in 2008 also, what we saw, we have to look at the evidence of different incidents that happened in the world. Even if there were private sector banks, private banks, the governments of those countries did not allow those banks to collapse. They came ahead and they bailed out. Now, in comparison, when you are looking at that time, if you look at those countries who bailed out that bank, we are looking at 5 to 6% of GDP. While now, if you will look at, if you are meaning to talk about the government's recapitalization bailout package for the PSU bank, it is hardly 0.5% of GDP, 0.25 in the first year and 0.25 in the second year. So, if in all these aspects, if the government can take the steps and ensure that the confidence of the public is restored and people must have a faith, I don't think it is wrong. I mean, yes, this is a serious issue, one must look at it, but I mean, all these people who are speaking about the privatization and all, I mean, bearing few people who have spoken in like 6 months or a year, everybody has woken up after this whole Nirav Modi aspects. Now, another important aspect that has come, the RBI report stated that in September, as far as the NPA is concerned, if it is 17% in the PSU, it is 40% in the private bank. So the data is showing a very different number. So what is data showing? So there has to be a proper checks and balances. We need to have a robust auditing mechanism. We must have a robust technology. We have to ensure that incidents like this, fraud like this do not take place, and we are able to checkmate such frauds in the system. One more point I want to
Hitesh,
point
just
out.
Give me a second. I'll just come back to you because I want to take the 2 points that you raised in particular. You know what? Just give me 1 second.
30 seconds. Nidhi, just give me 30 seconds. I'm finishing in 30 seconds my point. Nidhi, give me 30 seconds. I'm just making my point. One of the link to all these things is the shell company. And the biggest action that was taken out by the government was the crackdown on the shell company, because shell company is the only route through which you can try to siphon the money from the bank account. So this was another action that you have seen. So if there is a honest intention and action on behalf of the government, the confidence in the PSU bank is restored, and people on the public at large also views as to what is the action.
But first the scam happens. First the scam happens under this government's watch, and then the government says, "Wah wah, we're doing such a good job. Please pat us on the back for taking action." I mean, you know, I just want to say, I take your point about private banks because that is an important point, and I want to ask Shubhamoy about that.
I do not agree. I
don't think the argument can be made that the government is doing a good job when this has happened under the government's watch.
You are entitled for your own views.
I'm just saying that our honest taxpayers are angry today that people like Nirav Modi can flee the country, they can loot the bank of thousands of crores, and people like honest taxpayers have to pay for them.
No bank manager said this. I'm sorry, you are now playing cheap politics. No bank manager said it started in 2008.
There is a specific case taken by
Let's do away with the rhetoric now. Enough of blaming Nehru for everything. Let's focus on the here and now. There is a clear distinction between taking and giving loans. It's not a crime. Between NPAs, loans and willful default. Let's be very clear about the difference in these 3 categories and then address the issue. Let's not play politics on this. For a government and a strong prime minister and a strong finance minister to keep quiet on this issue for 8 long days, that's a crime in itself. What are you doing to restore the confidence of people, of depositors in our public sector banks? Please come out and respond. Don't send HRD ministers to respond on a scam which belongs to the finance ministry. Please stop this politics. Absolutely. Come out and respond first. We'll all support you if you have a strong policy. If you come and restore the confidence of people, we'll support you. But stop playing your politics, for God's sake. Enough of this. People don't want your politics. People want answers. If you don't have answers, say you don't have answers. But stop it. You cannot play these games
but
with the
Pawan,
country.
let me ask you
Mr.
that
Khera,
as
who
an
started the
institutional
politics?
problem,
When the
this does
incident
go
broke
back
out,
to the
you
UPA
were the
time
first
as well.
people
You
to
have
say
to take
this is a scam of
responsibility too.
NDA.
Nidhi,
Oh, this is the
this is
Eureka
Nidhi,
moment, this
the-
is the NDA
the
scam.
books of a
Who
bank
started
every
the
year.
politics?
The books
Are
are
you not
submitted
indulging
somewhere.
in politics every day?
No, if those
Are you
books
not
do not
indulging into
reflect
politics every
outstanding.
day?
Hitesh, give me a second. I'm coming back to you. Just give me a
I mean,
second. Let's
elections
just
are
try to have
there
a
in
conversation.
2019.
I don't want
Hitesh,
us
you are going to play
to
the
shout.
I think the viewers expect
course
us
you are
to
going to
have
play the
a mature
politics.
conversation so that
Guys,
their confidence
guys, we
is
just
restored.
shot a promo
Let's
saying
not
we're not
play
going to
politics,
shout on this
please.
program. Please, let's stick
Please
to
go
that.
to Republic or Times now.
No,
You
no,
will get
no.
enough opportunity.
No, no,
Let's
one
there
sec,
at
one
least
sec,
have a
one sec.
sensible discussion.
I'm
So,
asking
Nidhi,
you, look,
I am coming
the
to that.
point is, the Nirav Modi thing, for instance, did begin in 2011, right? So there is obviously a huge institutional problem here, which goes beyond which government is in power. There may have been the most LOUs issued last year, yes. But the fact that it goes that far back shows you that this isn't a problem that is sort of specific to a particular party.
I can absolutely understand there are institutional loopholes in under every government, which every government tries to plug those loopholes, but there's never a perfect system. I agree there. But coming back to this particular case, how can an LOU which starts in 2011 keep getting rolled over to 2018? Now that's something which experts like Mr. Bhattacharya here and Shubham there will also agree this is not really possible. Now, what are they doing to address that instead of just saying कि 2011 में शुरू हुआ बैंक ने कह दिया अरे साहब बैंक is your the MD of that bank is your HMV, but CBI despite being your HMV कि FIR में क्या लिखा है, please read the FIR, both the FIRs, and then come back to us.
But Hitesh, let me just ask you one question. Do you think honestly that that the mechanisms that are currently there, including the RBI, the banking board, Vinod Rai, have these completely failed? And they obviously have, if something like this can happen under their very noses. And it's not just Nirav Modi, I say that again and again, it's so many other cases also.
Well, I think the entire audit system has collapsed over here. I mean, we are in 2011 it should have been detected, 2012 it should have been detected, 2014, 2015, 2016. The very fact that nobody has ever noticed, you are looking at there is a private bank, Axis Bank also that was involved over here. That is, the system does not detect, the audit is not happening. And you know, today, I mean, I was reading that merely flagging, oh, there is a red flag is not good enough. I mean, idea is after red flag, what is the corrective action? And if there is no corrective action on a serious issue, in the 2 months or 3 months, the auditors can report and all the actions that is required. So this is one area where we will have to also consider that mere red flagging of any issue is sufficient, or the auditors have to go that extra mile. And also, so all these systems, I mean, all these frauds teaches us that things are becoming very sophisticated, and for a sophisticated frauds like this, we must have a sophisticated proper response so that incidents like this do
I think
not
that's a
happen
fair
in
point.
the future.
I think that's a fair point. I want to ask Mr. Bhattacharya though on this whole argument about whether privatizing public sector banks is the solution to that. You, I think, disagree with that point.
I disagree most respectfully with my distinguished colleague Mr. Shubham Bhattacharya. As the other gentleman has very correctly stated, during 2008 international scam with the collapse of, Lehman Brothers on September 13, 2008, it's all a creation of private sector banks and financial institutions. It is greed, number one, lack of enforcement of regulatory mechanism, owners, even the private owners failing miserably to control, and even the central bank failed. So therefore, even in India, Nidhi, you have had instances where we have had utter scams and failures of private banks. Ownership is not an issue. Let us not change ownership and think that overnight everything will be all right. What we need to do is immediately identify the loopholes so that in future it does not recur. And as I have told you, CBI, Enforcement Directorate, Central, then Income Tax Department, they are very ill equipped to crack this. You must immediately on a war footing employ and engage those who have actually worked in the seats and crack the scam first.
Well, let me ask Shubham about the point that you made. Why should we be convinced that private is necessarily better then?
Simply because you can't have a public sector bank collapsing. I mean, the argument that a private sector banks collapsed and public sector banks didn't collapse is a ludicrous argument, for the simple reason that you can't have a public sector banks collapsing. It will be supported by the state. Even private sector banks do get supported by the state, but the important point is a private sector bank is set up by the share capital of certain people. If that bank gets into trouble, those people take the haircut. Here, the entire population of this country, including the poorest who don't have a bank account, will tomorrow pay a certain percentage of money to ensure that these banks come back on track. What sort of a social justice system is that? That's simply the point. You can't compare public sector banks with private sector banks simply because public sector banks are owned by the government. Unless the government of a country collapses, like Germany did after the Second World War, public sector banks will not collapse. So that argument isn't there. It's not on the table. The problem is these banks have run into problems because of lack of audit, which most people here seem to be agreed on. Why is that happening? Because of the fact that it is nobody's responsibility. With whom does the buck stop? Today, in the Volkswagen scandal, the company's bosses have taken the hit. In this case, who is the company's boss?
Actually,
we are not even sure.
Actually, it's the finance minister, which comes to my next question, Shivam, is that is the government's explanation so far, and even the finance ministers, that this is stray case, it's the RBI, it's the auditors, is that enough? I mean, ultimately, the finance ministry is the boss of these banks.
So, a couple of things, starting with the difference between a public sector bank and a private sector bank. I think you rightly said that a bank is such a key institution for any economy and any nation that even if it's a huge public sector bank, the argument comes that it's too big to fail. So, it will not be allowed to fail. I would agree that a government bank, the priorities are not exactly the same as a private sector bank, which exists just to make a profit. In that case, the MD say...
No, hang on, Shiva, I just interfere here. Mr. Bhattacharya talked about the fact that private banks failed in 2008. But remember, when they failed, most of those governments, what they did was they entered into a commercial arrangement with them, that they give out a sort of a loan. You can argue with the loan, but the point is they give out a loan and the money has been paid.
Shivam, I want you to answer my question of where the buck stops. I want you to. I just have a couple of minutes. I want you to answer the question of where the buck stops. Doesn't it, in this case, stop with the government of India?
Of course.
In this case,
yeah, but why is the finance minister saying that it's about?
This finance minister making a stray. You see, the word stray is very, very unfortunate because this is not a stray case. This has been going on for the past 7 years. There are hundreds of transactions. It's been going on
for the last 40 years. Yeah. The point is that banks, the moment we nationalized banks, we did not tell them that along with the nationalization comes responsibility. We didn't create, and it's very difficult to create, frankly, a public sector entity in that sort of a thing.
If I may interrupt you, with your approval, do you know what kind of tremendous service nationalized banks have played?
Exactly.
You know?
Exactly.
You see, I have worked in a nationalized bank. I have worked in a sort of rural branch. I have worked in a multinational bank. And I know what tremendous services nationalized bank, they are going to the poorest man in the country. Exactly. And they are helping the poorest man to stand on their own feet. You want that these kind of persons should bank with a private bank and then fail and they should starve to death? Public sector banks must remain. It was a tremendous decision in 1969, and may I just also tell you for your information, I would not reveal full facts. On 15th of April 1986, banks were also nationalized. You know that? Andhra Bank, Corporation Bank, Oriental Bank of Commerce, New Bank of India, Vijaya Bank. You know why they were, and Punjab and Sindh Bank. Do you know, sir, why they were nationalized? Because one of them, I won't name, under what circumstances, was almost red. In fact, it was in 1980, Prime Minister Indira Gandhi came back as Prime Minister, and you quietly nationalized all six. Nobody knew.
To save that bank. Well, I'm out of time. I'm out of time today. So I just want to say, though, and as we continue to focus on this issue, that this is an issue I think that is serious enough to really ask for the Prime Minister to say something and reassure people. And we continue to see silence on certain key issues. This is something that affects everybody, and we do wish that he would say something about this somewhere. Thank you to you all for joining us tonight.